Well, good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. And Pastor Stefan, thank you for the invitation. It's always a pleasure to minister God's word to God's people. It's one of the great privileges of my life. My wife, Carolyn Custis James, is here. And Stefan, you're right. I'm madly in love with my wife. She is quite a well-known biblical scholar in her own right. If you may have read some of her books, and if you haven't, maybe you should. Well, glad to be here. One of the things that I find interesting as an historian is that this first Sunday after Easter, for centuries, was known as Quasimodo Sunday. Now, you may know the name Quasimodo from Victor Hugo's The Hunchback of Notre Dame. Well, in the book, Quasimodo, the Hunchback, the way he got affiliated with Notre Dame Cathedral was he was abandoned as an infant and left on the church steps of Notre Dame Cathedral. And it just so happens that he was abandoned on the first Sunday after Easter. And so in the book, he is named for that first Sunday, Quasimodo Sunday. And so the Hunchback was named after one of the church holidays, if you will. And the whole name, Quasimodo, comes from 1 Peter 2:2, where it says that like infants, we crave pure milk. And it's a lot about infants. And so the word has something to do, Quasimodo has something to do with, after the resurrection of Jesus, there is a feeding of all of us. And I love that. Some years ago, the Pope declared this first Sunday after Easter. He uses an interesting word. This is John Paul II many years ago. He called it Divine Mercy Sunday, which communicates really the essence of the Quasimodo Sunday idea. Well, I'm going to connect this as we go through, but let me begin with a story, a personal story that Carolyn and I actually were part of. It has been a number of years when we lived in Orlando, Florida for about 17 years, where I was a professor and later president of a seminary there. And I remember one day, toward the evening, Carol and I were on a highway and we took an exit. And you know, as often happens, there's someone standing on that exit ramp down at the end. And there was a ragged man with a cardboard sign. And I glanced at this man, as I always do, and he was a little unsteady on his feet. And he held up a sign, and the sign said, "I am homeless and hungry." And then it read, "What would Jesus do?" You know, this is back in those days where people wearing the wristbands, WWJD, what would Jesus do? And here he was, this bleary-eyed, wobbly man standing, and there was a can of beer at his feet. And he was holding up this sign to everyone, what would Jesus do? And I must confess that my initial response was, how dare he use WWJD to exploit others, to exploit Christian values. I was, in all candor, indignant that he would use Jesus. And I turned to my wife, and with a callous heart, I said to her, even Jesus wouldn't help that guy. I'm driving, I continue to pass the man, my calloused heart, and I'm driving, and my conscience began to bother me. And I started to ask myself, well, what would Jesus do in this circumstance? clearly this was a man who was trying to exploit my love and devotion to Jesus. And he seemed to be exploiting me so that he might get more money to buy beer, perpetuate his life of addiction, perhaps. And I felt like this man did not deserve my money or my time or my attention. But I'm driving, and my conscience is grabbing hold of me in a stronger and stronger way. And I'm wrestling. What would Jesus do? And then I had a kind of epiphany. It kind of dawned on me. I was looking at this in the wrong way. The question was not, what would Jesus do? The real question was, what did Jesus do? When you frame it as what would Jesus do, that's subject to some measure of speculations, some question of interpretation. But I began to think, what did he really do? And that's when my mind gravitated back to John chapter 8 and the story of the woman caught in adultery. And the question kept pounding on my brain and my conscience. What did Jesus do? And one question led to another. I began to think, now I'm a trained historian, so I began to say, well, how did the early church, how did they interpret Jesus' view of things? And then the next question. So the first question was, what did Jesus do? This is an outline of my sermon, by the way. What did Jesus do? What did the early Christians do? And the third most poignant question was, Frank, what will you do? And by extension to you at Manoia Church, what will you do? So the first question is this: what did Jesus do in this story? Let me read these verses briefly. John 8. The scribes and Pharisees brought a woman caught in adultery, and having set her in the center of the court, they said to Jesus, "Teacher, this woman has been caught in adultery, in the very act." Now, the law of Moses commanded us to stone such women. What then do you say? Abbreviated here. He straightened up and said to them, "He who is without sin among you, let him be the first to throw a stone at her." And when they heard this, they began to go out one by one, beginning with the older ones. And he was left alone, and the woman was left where she was, in the center of the court. And straightening up, Jesus said to her, "Woman, where are they? Does no one condemn you?" She says, "No one, Lord." And then Jesus said to her, "I do not condemn you either. Go, and from now on sin no more." Now, there's an awful lot we could say about this passage. I can only focus in on one bit. Now, when you read the story, and you have the basic outline of the story, you know the story, you're familiar with it, I want to draw your attention to two indisputable facts about this story. The first indisputable fact, nobody debates this. This woman was guilty. She was caught in the act of adultery. She was guilty, and according to the law of Moses, deserved death. Let's make no mistake about it. This is an exceedingly serious situation. Verse 4, this woman has been caught in adultery in the very act. This is not about rumor. This is not about innuendo. This is about someone who was caught in the act. She's guilty. Now, it is irritating to me, personally, that only the woman is brought to Jesus. You know, it does take two to tango. At least that's what I understand. But somehow in this patriarchal culture, and the Pharisees are trying to entrap Jesus, and in their haste, perhaps, they just focused on the woman. She's easier to manipulate and to bring down the house on her. And so the man is ignored in this process. We just don't know the full details. We just know that they brought the woman and the man is somehow ignored in all of this process. So the first indisputable fact, she's guilty. The second indisputable fact is that Jesus came to her rescue anyway. Let me just say that one more time. She's guilty. And Jesus came to her rescue anyway. Verse 11, I do not condemn you either, and from now on, go and sin no more. Jesus has literally saved her life. And he does so at great personal risk. He knew, she knew, that the penalty for adultery was death. And still, Jesus does not condemn her. At least on the surface, Jesus is in technical violation of the Mosaic law. On this day, at this moment, in this text, the grace of God overcame the law. And isn't that the logo of this church? Grace changes everything. This story lives out your logo. Grace changes everything. I was glad to see that, by the way. The law called for stoning. Now, if you think about this story and you sort of let your mind run a little bit, there are very few details about the circumstances. We don't know anything about the woman other than that she was caught in adultery in the act. We know El Zippo about the man. What we do know, and the very thing that blows my mind, I can't read it without being deeply moved. Jesus rescued a guilty, undeserving sinner. That's what he did. Now, I'm struck by the fact that Jesus did not do as I might have done. First, let's determine the facts of the case. There's no sense here that Jesus tried to get all the facts together before he made a judgment. He did not ask, are there mitigating circumstances? He did not ask who seduced who. He did not even ask if she was repentant. There is no precondition of any kind referenced here. That's what's so extraordinary about this story. We don't know if she was a serial adulteress. We don't know if she was an addict, an alcoholic. We don't know if she was so poor that she was selling her body to put food on the table for her and her children. We don't know if she had been trafficked. We just don't know the story. But at the fundamental level, this story is not so much about the woman. This story is about Jesus. This episode in the ministry of Jesus is not so much about the worthiness or the unworthiness of the woman. It is about the grace of the Lord Jesus Christ to a guilty, undeserving sinner. It's his compassion. It's about grace. It's about radical grace, or as some have named this first Sunday after Easter, Divine Mercy Sunday. If you want to know what this sermon's about, it's about divine mercy. Undeserved kindness. It's about grace. So that's what Jesus did. I want to take just a moment and talk about how the early church lived out this kind of grace that we see displayed by Jesus so powerfully, so overwhelmingly. Now, as I said, I'm an historian by training, and one of the things I like about that education that I've had is I've been taught to step back and try to get some larger perspective. That's very valuable. We live sometimes in our day and age from moment to moment, and sometimes it's valuable to step back and look at the broader history or the broader context. So I want to ask the question, how did those early Christians behave? Did they get this message of Jesus, this message of radical grace, this message of divine mercy? Did they get that? So the question is, did the first Christians exhibit this kind of radical grace? I want to tell you about the early church. It wasn't perfect, and I don't want to suggest that at all. But it's an extraordinary story that moves me every time I tell it. In the first few centuries, we all know that early Christians were persecuted by the Roman state. The Emperor Nero was notorious for killing Christians in the most gruesome of ways. He used to have garden parties at night. And do you know what he used for candles? Burning Christians. That's how he got, amid the screams and the smell, they had a garden party. So persecution by the Roman state could be and was awful. But the most astonishing thing is that in the midst of this terrible, gruesome, cruel persecution of the small minority of people called Christians, was not that they were persecuted. That's not the most important thing to realize. The most important thing is to note is that it's during the persecution that the church grew exponentially. It's hard to wrap your head around that. When the persecution was its most intense, that is precisely the point at which the church grew exponentially. The great church father Tertullian said, "The blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church." It's a marvelous, fundamental truth. Whether you're a liberal historian or a conservative historian, we all agree the church grew amid persecution. And the question is, why? How? I want to submit to you, and I'm not the only scholar who says this, many secular scholars will say the same thing. The Christian church grew because of its radical grace. Let me explain. In the Greco-Roman world of the first century, life was cheap. One of the ways we see how cheap life was is that, as a general rule, females were less valued than males, and especially infant females. They were disposable infant females. You think about ISIS today and how they treat women. Well, it was that bad or worse in the first century. And what they would do in the Greco-Roman world, commonplace, is that if a mother gave birth to a female, it was not uncommon to take that newborn baby and cast it upon the dung heap outside of the village where all the human waste and refuge and garbage was accumulated, and to leave that infant baby girl there to die of exposure. We have a letter from the first century written by a husband to his wife. He says, quote, "If it's a boy, keep it. If it's a girl, discard it." Straightforward, no compunction at all. If it's a boy, keep it. If it's a girl, kill it. Here's what the Christians did that blew the minds of the pagans in the first century. The Christians, when they knew and found out that there was an infant girl cast upon the dung heap, these Christians would go and climb through the human waste and the refuse, and they would rescue these little girls and raise them in the nurture and admonition of the Lord. You see, there were two possible futures for these little girls. One was simply death by exposure. But there's one thing worse than that, probably, is that the pagan priests would sometimes go and get these little infant girls and raise them to be temple prostitutes in pagan temples. Maybe there are things worse than death, but that's what would happen. And the Christians would go, and they became vehicles of divine mercy. Not only females were cast upon the dung heap, but little boys who were somehow disfigured or underdeveloped, they too were cast upon the dung heap. The great Stoic philosopher Seneca says, "Disfigured offspring we destroy. Children too, if they are born feeble and ill-formed, we drown them." So little boys could also be cast upon the dung heap, particularly if they were ill-formed in some way. You see how this plays with Victor Hugo and the Hunchback of Notre Dame. The Hunchback of Notre Dame was disfigured, and he was abandoned on Quasimodo Sunday. One of the main reasons that Christianity prospered, blossomed in a period of persecution is because the pagan world did not have categories for the kind of grace that Christians displayed day in, day out. They had never seen anything like this. How crazy was it to climb through refuse to rescue a little girl who has no value, or a disfigured little boy who has no value? They didn't have categories for that. It blew their minds. And not only did the early Christians rescue abandoned children, but they provided shelter for the older, aged folks, for the poor, for the widows. They purchased freedom of slaves. They engaged. They became vehicles of divine mercy in their world. The Roman Emperor Julian was so upset by Christian compassion. He was a pagan, and he was mad at Christians. He says, "Those darn Christians," that's my translation, "those darn Christians support not only their own poor, but ours as well." You see, there was an indiscriminate quality to the grace of these early Christians. Those little girls had not professed faith. Or sometimes the poor people they weren't Christians. But the early church reached out to the pagan poor as well as the Christian poor. It was indiscriminate grace. You see, they took the teaching of Jesus very seriously to be their brother's keeper. Is it any wonder? Is it any wonder that the pagan world was turned upside down when they saw this kind of lifestyle? Something they'd never seen before. You see, these early Christians followed the example of Jesus that we saw displayed in John 8. They understood something of what grace really, really means. And now we come to the final question. First question, what did Jesus do? The second question is, what did the early church do? How do they understand this teaching of grace? The question now is, Frank, what will you do? And by extension, the question is, Manoia Church, what will you do? One of the things I wrestle with as a contemporary Christian is, have we lost touch with this kind of radical grace? This is not an easy question to answer. I think it's probably both yes and no. Of course, many Christians have from the very beginning shown extraordinary grace. They have and they continue to be on the forefront of compassion at home and abroad. I'm always encouraged when I read about what World Vision is doing, or International Justice Mission, freeing girls who are in the sex trade, or even Bono, lead singer of U2. Yes, I listen to U2, and I'm proud of it. But Bono is a real Christian, and he has lived that out. So when I see people like that, I'm encouraged, and I can't lose heart. I know that Christians are still engaged, still trying to live lives of radical grace. I also find that many young people, many millennials, and many of those who have embraced this missional perspective, seeing themselves as missionaries in this world, they too have embraced this, and it gladdens my heart, I must say. It's also true that some Christians have remained hesitant when it comes to helping the homeless, alcoholics, drug addicts, people with HIV/AIDS. I understand some of the hesitations. In fact, I had some of those hesitations when I saw that ragged man at the street corner. One of the things that went through my mind when I saw him standing at the corner was, I saw the beer, and I thought, do I want to continue feeding a habit that is obviously destroying this man's life? That's a legitimate concern. I thought about that. And I understand that people hesitate. And I think, no one wants to support or feed bad behavior or a bad addiction. We don't want to do that. There's also this concern many have had, and it's actually been an issue of late in the theological debates online and so forth, about something we've heard called the social gospel. And what that really references is the fact that some folks have said, let's forget the teachings of Jesus. No need to talk about the resurrection of Jesus. Let's just be nice to people. Let's just be gracious. And what they've done is they've effectively collapsed the gospel into outreach. And that's all it is. They've abandoned the message of Jesus and embraced the example of Jesus in terms of his external behavior. So I appreciate the tensions that we all feel about these kinds of actions. But let me stress something, and this is something that we at Missio Seminary believe to the core of our being. We must have Christian orthodoxy. We need to believe in the resurrection of Jesus. That's real. Our faith is bound up in that bodily resurrection. That's what Easter is about. That's what we remember. That fundamental truth cannot be pushed aside in any way. But that same truth on Quasimodo Sunday, the Sunday after Easter, manifests itself in actions, orthopraxy, that is, the doing of good deeds. The true gospel of Jesus Christ, the grace of Jesus Christ, is not only, it includes what we know to be sure, but that knowledge has got to impact my hands and my feet and my heart. The way I live, the way I talk, the way I engage. You must have both orthodoxy and orthopraxy. I'm reminded of John Calvin. I've studied John a lot, and I think folks have sometimes misunderstood him. But he has a quote that I think is actually wonderful. He says, Christianity is a doctrine not merely of the tongue, of the mouth, but of the life. John Calvin, 5 centuries ago, understood that you can't just have truth up here if it doesn't manifest itself out here. Orthodoxy and orthopraxy are two sides of the same coin. So the real question for me and for you is what will you do, what will I do in the light of what Jesus has done for me and for you? Am I more deserving than the adulterous woman? Am I more deserving than the alcoholic standing on the street corner? I can give you an unequivocal answer to both of those questions with regard to myself. I am not more deserving. Maybe less deserving. Now, I don't know you in detail. I don't know your personal lives. But I do know one thing about you, is that you are no more deserving than the adulterous woman. You are no more deserving than the alcoholic on the street. You're a sinner saved by grace, just like I am. Jesus has bestowed his divine mercy on you. Do you know what grace is? I mean, this is in your name. Grace changes everything. Grace is undeserved kindness. That is to say, you don't deserve it. But God gives it to you anyway. That's the essence of grace. And it does change everything. It changes how you think. It changes how you live. Now, when I think about all of this, and I'm really sharing my heart with you on this, none of these things are simple. How do you engage the world? How do you engage such things as a homeless person? Well, you wrestle with these issues. I have other priorities in my life. I've got a sick granddaughter. I'm more concerned about that than I am the homeless man on the street. And I only have so much money. I only have so much time. I can't feed everyone everywhere all the time. And what about accountability? Why isn't that person responsible for their own lives? And we've got our own personal trials. Struggles in our marriages, struggles with our kids, struggles with all kinds of things. So these are not simple issues. I will not step down. I do not mean to suggest that these are easy questions on how do you live this out. Living out the faith is hard. It's full of tension and challenge, and you may never get it quite right. But that's exactly the point. I think Jesus, from this story in John 8, at the very least, he wants you and he wants me to wrestle with it. He wants your conscience to be pricked, just as mine was. And whatever you decide to do in the final analysis, that's one thing. But I think the Lord wants us to wrestle with how do I live out my faith in various circumstances, knowing that I'm not going to do it right every time. But at least I'm wrestling with it. I feel the pain of a person who's lost their job and doesn't have a place to live. If I'm wrestling with that, or if I see a young person on the street who's a heroin addict or struggling with opioid, do they have a responsibility? Yes. But can I enter into that a little bit and find out what were the circumstances that gave rise to that? Can I enter into that somehow? Can I wrestle with it? All I think we can ask of one another is to honestly wrestle with how we live out our faith. I do not have all the answers, brothers and sisters. I genuinely struggle. The truth is, I don't give money to every person I see on the street. The truth is, Jesus has set the bar too high for me in so many ways. Well, I come to the end of the story. That day, when I saw the ragged man at the street corner, my conscience would not let go. It continued to trouble me. And finally, I turned the car around. I did the only godly thing you can do. I went to McDonald's. Now, that's supposed to be funny, and I need a little more response. The godly thing was to go to McDonald's. I went and I bought some food. And I drove back to this unsteady, bleary-eyed, drunken man who was trying to exploit my compassion as a Christian, who didn't deserve grace. And I gave him some food to go with his beer. I don't even know if that was the right thing to do in some cases. And I tell you the truth, my conscience still bothers me on a regular basis about what to do and when to do it. But I do find solace in one thing, that I have a Savior who has granted mercy to me by rescuing a guilty, undeserving sinner like the woman caught in adultery. And therein I find my hope and my life.